Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. The village of Dunwich was, as always, a place of quiet routines. The kind of village where everyone knew everyone, where the scent of freshly baked bread could be smelled from nearly every cottage, and where the only real excitement was the occasional debate over the best way to prune the village's ancient rose bushes. That particular autumn morning, the village square was bustling with its usual activity. The small market stalls were filled with fresh vegetables, the postman was busy delivering parcels, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the village green. To anyone passing through, Dunwich might have seemed perfectly ordinary, a peaceful, quaint village, where life unfolded at a pace that was as unhurried as the seasons. But even in the most peaceful of places, secrets lie buried beneath the surface. And one such secret, Miss Marple was soon to discover, was about to be uncovered in the most unexpected of ways. The excitement in Dunwich that day was centered on Lady Evelyn Hargrove's annual garden party. A much-anticipated event, the garden party was always held in the sprawling grounds of Hargrove Hall, the grand estate of the Hargrove family. It was a social event where the village's most prominent residents gathered for tea, sandwiches, and an afternoon of gossip. Miss Marple, though often invited to such occasions, preferred to observe from the sidelines. She was content to enjoy the view from the garden, her seat tucked in a quiet corner where she could watch the people around her without being noticed. She had long ago learned the value of listening to people's unsaid words, the way their bodies betrayed their true thoughts when they thought no one was watching. This year's party, however, was different. There was a restlessness in the air, as though the village was on the brink of something. As Miss Marple observed, she couldn't help but notice how the guests seemed more nervous, their glances a little too quick, their words a little too carefully chosen. Lady Evelyn, ever the gracious hostess, made her rounds with bright smiles and polite laughter, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was not quite right. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple was seated near the edge of the garden, sipping her tea, when a sudden shout rang out from across the lawn. It came from Mrs. Marjorie Bellamy, a rather flamboyant woman who had been chatting with the local vicar. "Someone's gone missing," Mrs. Bellamy cried, her voice shrill with alarm. A murmur of unease rippled through the gathered guests as they turned toward Mrs. Bellamy, who was pointing toward the hedge at the far end of the garden. Miss Marple's keen eyes narrowed. The missing person was no stranger. It was Dr. Benjamin Carter, the village's well-respected physician. He had been talking to Lady Evelyn only moments before, and now, it seemed, he had vanished without a trace. As the search for Dr. Carter began, Miss Marple remained seated at the edge of the garden, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The villagers began to fan out across the estate grounds, calling his name, and the air grew thick with tension. Miss Marple noticed that Lady Evelyn's face had gone white, her lips trembling slightly as she tried to offer reassuring words to those around her. But even from where she sat, Miss Marple could see the unease in Lady Evelyn's eyes. The kind of unease that wasn't caused by concern for Dr. Carter's safety. It was something else entirely. As Miss Marple watched the guests scatter, she caught a glimpse of something strange near the garden's far hedge. An old wooden chest, half hidden beneath the overgrown ivy. It looked out of place, as though it had been there for years, untouched. The chest was old and worn, its wood weathered by time. Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple rose, moving toward the chest with her usual quiet determination. She had no reason to suspect that it was connected to Dr. Carter's disappearance. At least, not yet. But she had learned over the years that sometimes it was the most seemingly insignificant details that held the answers to a mystery. The chest was locked, but as Miss Marple crouched down to examine it, she saw a slight discoloration on the lid, a small indentation that looked like a keyhole that had been tampered with. She felt a sudden rush of certainty. This chest was hiding something, and it was hiding it for a reason. Miss Marple glanced around. Most of the guests were still combing the grounds, and Lady Evelyn was speaking with the local constable. The time to search the chest was now. Miss Marple gently pried open the chest, her fingers nimble despite her age. Inside, she found an assortment of old books and papers, some yellowed with age, others pristine but clearly well preserved. It seemed like the kind of trunk one might find in an attic, filled with items meant to be forgotten. But it was one particular item that caught her eye, a set of letters, tied with a ribbon, resting on top of the stack. They were yellowed, their edges frayed, and the ink on them had faded with time. The writing was neat, but Miss Marple could tell it wasn't recent. Curious, she opened the top letter, carefully unfolding the paper to reveal its contents. The first line caught her breath. "To my dearest Evelyn, if you ever find these letters, I beg you to understand why I did what I did. The secrets we kept were never meant to destroy us, but they have. You will understand when it is too late." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had no idea who this letter was from, but she could feel a chill in the air. Something was very wrong. And this letter felt like the key to something much larger than a missing person. She placed the letter back into the chest, but her mind was already racing. Why would Dr. Carter be connected to these letters? And why was Lady Evelyn so clearly disturbed by the mention of them? Chapter 2. The garden party continued, but the unease that had rippled through the guests was now a tangible tension that clung to the air. Even the bright sun, high above the gathered crowd, felt unnaturally warm in its intensity, casting long shadows beneath the trees where a silent search was already underway. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her thoughts focused on the letters she had just uncovered. There was something about them, something unsettling. They spoke of secrets, of hidden truths that had been buried for years, but she knew well enough that the true danger didn't lie in the secrets themselves. It was in the people who kept them. Her mind began to race as she carefully folded the letters back into the chest and latched it closed. There was no time to dwell on them now. Dr. Carter was still missing, and the village was growing more anxious with each passing minute. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and made her way towards her. Lady Evelyn, who was speaking with Constable Green by the large fountain. Lady Evelyn looked flustered, her face drawn tight with worry. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, as though trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "Lady Evelyn," Miss Marple called gently, her voice soft but deliberate. Lady Evelyn turned, her expression softening as she caught sight of Miss Marple. "Ah, Miss Marple, I don't know what to think. This is all so dreadful. Dr. Carter, of all people." Miss Marple approached, her gaze steady. Yes, it is quite unsettling. And yet, I feel there may be more to this than meets the eye. Lady Evelyn frowned slightly, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the distant hedge where the searchers were combing the area, calling out for Dr. Carter. The way things are unfolding, it seems there may be some old wounds here, ones that some of us might wish to remain forgotten. Lady Evelyn's lips tightened, and she glanced over her shoulder toward the gathering crowd. I don't understand what you mean, Miss Marple. Dr. Carter has been a pillar of this village for years. Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but knowing. Oh, I'm sure he has, dear. But you see, people change when secrets are revealed. And sometimes it is the things we wish to forget that hold the greatest weight. Lady Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but was interrupted by a sudden voice. Miss Marple? Lady Evelyn? Constable Green said, stepping forward with an air of concern. We've found Dr. Carter's belongings, his coat and medical bag, but there's no sign of him. It's as if he vanished into thin air. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. His belongings, the coat and medical bag, were troubling details. Dr. Carter was well known in the village, and it seemed unlike him to leave such personal items behind, especially in the middle of the afternoon. There's something off about all this, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She turned to Constable Green. Have you looked near the old well or the tool shed? I've often seen people wander off in those directions when they're looking for some quiet space. The constable nodded. We've checked the usual places, but perhaps we should extend our search farther. Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed with concern, but she quickly masked it with a careful smile. I'm sure Dr. Carter will turn up soon, Miss Marple. He's probably just gone for a walk, needing a moment to himself. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She had seen Lady Evelyn's reaction, the brief flicker of something unsettling in her eyes. It was the kind of reaction people had when they were trying to hide something. The question was, what was Lady Evelyn trying to hide? As the search continued, Miss Marple remained close to Lady Evelyn, careful to observe the reactions of the people around her. Her suspicions were growing, as they often did when the atmosphere felt too controlled, too calm for the events that had transpired. The guests who had earlier laughed and joked now wore pained expressions. Even the local vicar, who had appeared, so comfortable in his black robes, now looked unsettled as he spoke to some of the village's elders. His voice was low, and his hands were clasped tightly in front of him. Miss Marple had seen such reactions before. It wasn't uncommon for a person to feel deeply uncomfortable when they were on the edge of a revelation. But what was it that was making these people so uneasy? The guests had been chatting and laughing only hours before, and now they were more like actors waiting for their next cue, caught in a play they hadn't rehearsed. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple excused herself from Lady Evelyn's side, moving to the edge of the garden, where she could observe from a distance. She paused as she passed the edge of the hedge where the searchers had already combed through the area. One of the men, James Tilley, the gardener, waved his hand to indicate that they had found nothing new. Miss Marple's eyes wandered over the lush greenery, and then, just beyond the hedge, she caught sight of something. It was barely visible, hidden in the brush, but it was a dark stain against the vibrant green of the garden. She stepped forward, her sharp gaze taking in every detail. It was a small, bloodied handkerchief. Miss Marple bent down to examine it more closely. The stain was dark, but it was unmistakably fresh, as though someone had wiped away a wound. The handkerchief was not Dr. Carter's, as far as Miss Marple could tell. It was too fine, the monogram too elaborate. She stood slowly, her mind piecing together fragments of the mystery. The blood, the missing physician, the sudden tension in the air, all pointed to something more than an innocent disappearance. As she turned back to the gathering guests, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. Secrets were beginning to surface, and someone in the village had a lot to answer for. Chapter 3. The discovery of the bloodied handkerchief sent a ripple of unease through Miss Marple's thoughts. The garden, once filled with light-hearted chatter, now seemed too quiet, as if everyone were waiting for something to unfold. She tucked the handkerchief into her bag, the weight of it heavy with meaning, though she couldn't yet explain why. The search for Dr. Carter continued with urgency, but there was an underlying sense of frustration. The guests were growing more anxious by the hour, their eyes shifting as they exchanged nervous glances. Yet, none dared to speak openly about the unease that had taken root, and Miss Marple, ever the observer, could feel the undercurrent of secrets tightening around them. Lady Evelyn, though still keeping up appearances, had grown quieter. She had avoided eye contact with Miss Marple since the brief exchange earlier, and Miss Marple could sense that she was beginning to question whether she could keep the truth hidden much longer. After the initial rush of searching the estate grounds, Miss Marple returned to her seat near the garden's edge, her mind racing through the details. The bloodied handkerchief was far from enough to draw conclusions, but it hinted at something darker, something buried under the surface of this well-mannered village. The only problem was the absence of any concrete evidence. Dr. Carter's medical bag and coat had been left behind, but what did that suggest? He had been missing for hours now, and yet there was no sign of struggle, no indication that he had left the grounds by his own accord. Miss Marple's gaze shifted back toward Lady Evelyn, who was now speaking with her husband, Sir Michael Hargrove. Sir Michael, a tall, imposing figure, had been unusually quiet throughout the afternoon, as though he were waiting for the inevitable. His eyes kept darting toward the house, as though he were anticipating someone's arrival, or perhaps an announcement. There was something in the way Lady Evelyn's shoulders tensed when Sir Michael spoke that made Miss Marple's heart beat a little faster. Unease, perhaps, or guilt? Lady Evelyn had been too eager to dismiss the possibility of something more sinister happening, too eager to rush to conclusions that didn't involve any sort of hidden conflict. It was time, Miss Marple knew, to start looking for the motives that lay beneath the surface. Someone was hiding something, and she would have to untangle their web of lies. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple had the opportunity to speak with Marjorie Bellamy, who had been the first to spot Dr. Carter's disappearance. Marjorie was known for her flamboyant nature, always eager to share the latest gossip and contribute to the village's social affairs. As Miss Marple approached her, Marjorie was standing by the fountain, fiddling with her lace gloves. Her usual upbeat demeanor had slipped. She was clearly unsettled. "Miss Marple," Marjorie greeted her with a tight smile, clearly forcing cheerfulness. "I do hope you haven't been too disturbed by the day's events." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I'm afraid I'm more disturbed by the mystery than by the events themselves, Mrs. Bellamy. Dr. Carter's disappearance. It's all so strange." Marjorie's eyes darted briefly toward the house, then back to Miss Marple. "Oh, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, don't you think? Dr. Carter is probably out somewhere, having wandered off. I'm sure he'll turn up when he's good and ready." Miss Marple studied her for a moment. Her words seemed rehearsed. Too rehearsed, in fact. "You speak as though you're quite certain, Mrs. Bellamy, but we both know that in cases like these, there's often more than meets the eye. Don't you agree?" Marjorie blinked, clearly caught off guard by Miss Marple's directness. She hesitated, her smile faltering. "Well, yes, I suppose that's true. But what do you think happened? I've heard some rumors." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "People are starting to say that it was something more than just an accident. A crime, perhaps." Miss Marple leaned in, her tone soft but firm. "What rumors, Mrs. Bellamy? You've heard something specific, haven't you?" Marjorie glanced around again, then lowered her voice. "I've heard talk about Dr. Carter's connections. You know, his time before he came here. Some people think he may have been involved with, well, some unsavory individuals, people who are perhaps not so eager to leave him alone." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already piecing together the implications. Connections from Dr. Carter's past? That could explain the nervous tension that seemed to permeate the village. It seemed Dr. Carter hadn't just been a well-respected physician. He had potentially been tied to something far darker. But what? Exactly? Before Miss Marple could press for further details, a voice interrupted. "Miss Marple, may I have a word?" It was Sir Michael Hargrove, and the edge in his voice made it clear he was not here to engage in idle conversation. Miss Marple followed Sir Michael toward a quiet corner of the garden, away from the watchful eyes of the guests. The evening was beginning to settle, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The air was still heavy with the weight of the day's uncertainty. "Miss Marple," Sir Michael began, his tone low, "I must ask you to refrain from asking too many questions." His eyes were sharp, but there was a genuine unease about him. Miss Marple kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she was already running through a list of reasons why Sir Michael was now speaking to her. "And why would that be, Sir Michael?" she asked politely. He looked around, ensuring no one else was nearby before speaking again. "Because Dr. Carter's disappearance is none of your business, Miss Marple. We have already involved the authorities, and there is no reason for you to investigate further." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "I only seek to understand what's happened, Sir Michael. If there is something the village should be aware of, it is better we address it. Sooner rather than later, don't you think?" He stiffened, but his lips pressed into a thin line. "You have no idea what you're meddling in, Miss Marple. There are things in the past that are better left undisturbed. Trust me, you don't want to know." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her intuition buzzing. She had heard enough. Sir Michael was hiding something from Dr. Carter's past, and possibly something from his own. The urgency in his voice, the veiled threat in his words, it all pointed to fear. Fear of what might come to light if the wrong questions were asked. "I'll let you know if I find anything, Sir Michael," Miss Marple said calmly, her voice a soft assurance. But there was no mistaking the steel in her words. "But remember, it's the truth that always finds its way out, no matter how deeply it's buried." As night fell, the village of Dunwich was still and heavy, the quiet broken only by the soft hum of insects and the occasional murmur of voices in the distance. Miss Marple returned to her seat by the garden, her thoughts swirling with fragments of the mystery she was piecing together. Lady Evelyn had clearly been trying to hide something, and Sir Michael was desperate to keep the past buried. The bloodied handkerchief, Dr. Carter's disappearance, and now the mention of unsavory connections. Everything pointed toward a deeper conspiracy, one that had been hidden from the village for far too long. And Miss Marple knew, as she sat quietly in the fading light, that the truth was closer than it had ever been. It was only a matter of time before it came to the surface, and when it did, she would be ready. Chapter 4. The night passed quietly, the last light of the day fading over the village of Dunwich, but the undercurrent of unease remained. The search for Dr. Carter continued throughout the evening, though there were no new leads. Miss Marple, despite the long hours, was restless. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still too many gaps in the puzzle. The next morning, the village felt different. It had been a long time since a disappearance had so deeply unsettled. Dunwich, and even the usual hum of daily life, seemed muted. People walked a little faster, eyes glancing nervously from side to side, but no one dared speak of the growing tension aloud. Miss Marple had been awake early, her mind still sifting through the events of the previous day. The bloodied handkerchief was still tucked away in her bag, its implications clear. Someone had been injured. Someone had been trying to conceal a crime. But who and why? She had already determined that Dr. Carter's disappearance was not a simple case of wandering off. There was more to it, something much darker. The missing medical bag, the coat left behind, the blood, it all pointed to something deliberate, not a casual mistake. But the question remained, was Dr. Carter the victim, or was he part of something more dangerous? Miss Marple was drawn out of her thoughts by the sound of footsteps approaching her cottage. She turned, her gaze sharp as she saw Lady Evelyn walking down the lane. The woman's face was drawn tight, and there was an unmistakable weariness in her step. She had been avoiding Miss Marple since their conversation the previous afternoon, but now she appeared resigned to the inevitable. "Miss Marple," Lady Evelyn called out, her voice soft, but with a note of something like defeat. "May I speak with you?" Miss Marple's lips curled into a warm but measured smile. "Of course, dear. Please, come in." Lady Evelyn entered the I cottage, but there was no false cheer in her demeanor. She was clearly struggling with something, her hands tightly clasped in front of her. She was trying to appear composed, but the effort was clear. "I didn't want to bother you yesterday, Miss Marple," she began, her voice heavy with unspoken emotion. "But, after thinking it over, I must confess, I'm very much out of my depth in all this." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "I understand, Lady Evelyn. It is quite unsettling when something like this happens in such a small place. The village isn't used to disappearances, after all." She paused, her tone gentle but firm. "And you know, my dear, you can always confide in me if something is troubling you. Sometimes the smallest detail is enough to shed light on the whole situation." Lady Evelyn stiffened slightly at the suggestion, but she seemed to accept the offer nonetheless. "It's not Dr. Carter's disappearance that bothers me, as dreadful as it is. It's the things I can't remember, Miss Marple. There's something I've been trying to push out of my mind, but it keeps coming back. And I'm afraid it's tied to all this." She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly. "You see, She stopped, her eyes darting to the door as though checking for eavesdroppers. Miss Marple could see the anxiety creeping into her expression. "Please, Lady Evelyn, take your time," Miss Marple said softly, offering a seat next to the fire. "Whatever it is, you're not alone in this. You don't have to carry it by yourself." Lady Evelyn finally sank into the chair, her hands still shaking. "It's about Ben Carter, Miss Marple," she said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night." Miss Marple tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "That night? The night before Dr. Carter disappeared?" Lady Evelyn nodded, her face pale. "Yes, that night. I found him in the study, Miss Marple. He was drinking heavily, looking disheveled, like something had shaken him to his core. And when he saw me, he seemed so relieved, almost as though he'd been waiting for someone to appear. He said it was nothing, that it was just the stress of his work. But he looked so terrified, Miss Marple. And then, before I could ask him What was really wrong? He told me to leave him be, that he'd take care of it in the morning. I left him there, thinking it was just another of his odd moods. Miss Marple's expression was carefully neutral as she listened. There was something in Lady Evelyn's story that felt off, a detail too small to explain, yet too significant to ignore. She leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle. "And did Dr. Carter tell you what he had been so upset about?" Lady Evelyn shook her head, her gaze distant. "No, he wouldn't. But I could tell something was wrong." He kept looking over his shoulder, as though he thought someone was watching him. There was fear in his eyes, Miss Marple. Fear of something he couldn't control. A shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. Fear of something beyond his control. Now that was a dangerous thought. Lady Evelyn's confession was more than just a casual admission. It was a revelation. If Dr. Carter had been afraid the night before his disappearance, it was possible that his fears weren't just about his work or the village's mundane troubles. There was something much darker at play, something that had been lurking beneath the surface for years. As Lady Evelyn continued, Miss Marple's mind was already working, connecting the pieces. Dr. Carter's past, his fears, his sudden isolation, these were all important clues, and they pointed toward something far more dangerous than an accidental disappearance. "Do you know what it was that he was afraid of?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice calm yet insistent. Lady Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "No, but I do know that he had been looking through some of the old family documents recently. Documents that had been left by my late father-in-law, Lord Hargrove. He never told me what they contained, but I overheard him speaking to Sir Michael about them last week. I think—" She paused, her eyes suddenly wide with realization. "I think they might have something to do with all this." Miss Marple stood up, her mind working rapidly. She needed to see those documents. They could hold the answers to everything. Dr. Carter's fears, the mysterious disappearances, the secrets that were clearly hidden in this very house. "I must see these documents, Lady Evelyn," Miss Marple said decisively. "And I believe Sir Michael may have more to tell us than he realizes." Chapter 5. The following day, Miss Marple made her way back to Hargrove Hall with Lady Evelyn in tow. The previous evening's revelations had stirred something deep within her. Dr. Carter's mysterious behavior, the documents from Lord Hargrove's estate, and his sudden disappearance, they were all pieces of a puzzle that, Miss Marple felt, were starting to fit together. As they arrived at the grand estate, the opulent facade of Hargrove Hall seemed almost out of place against the backdrop of the troubling events. Lady Evelyn led Miss Marple to her husband's study, a room filled with old, leather-bound books, papers, and framed portraits of ancestors who had long since passed. Sir Michael was not in the room, but the tension in the air was palpable, as though the very walls were holding on to secrets that had been locked away for years. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle in before speaking. "I imagine this room has seen many confessions over the years," Miss Marple observed gently. Her voice was calm, but her words carried an undercurrent of certainty. Lady Evelyn nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "It has, and many decisions that should have been left unmade." Miss Marple could feel the shift in the atmosphere as she moved toward the large oak desk. Papers were scattered across its surface, but there was a certain orderliness to the chaos, as if someone had tried to maintain a sense of control over what had been left undone. She noticed a pile of documents neatly stacked in one corner of the desk, old letters, legal papers, and financial records that seemed out of place among the other documents. Without asking, Miss Marple carefully picked up the topmost paper and began reading it. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly, but each word sent a clearer signal that these were important and dangerous documents. There were mentions of land disputes, references to hidden debts, and troubling implications about certain investments that Sir Michael had made in the past. These documents, Miss Marple said quietly, placing them back on the desk, reveal more than just business matters, don't they? Lady Evelyn stood behind her, her gaze distant. Yes, they do. They're linked to Lord Hargrove's old dealings. Dealings that Sir Michael has tried to sweep under the rug for years. Miss Marple turned to face Lady Evelyn. And you believe these are the papers Dr. Carter was looking through before his disappearance? Lady Evelyn's face tightened. Yes, Dr. Carter was trying to uncover the truth behind some of these deals. I think he had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, something that had been hidden away for far too long. Miss Marple paused, processing the information. If Dr. Carter had discovered something about Sir Michael's past, something that could potentially ruin him, it would explain the fear he had exhibited the night before his disappearance. It was clear now that the physician had not simply been a victim of a random crime. He had been caught up in a larger, more dangerous web of deceit. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted as the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The door to the study opened, and in walked Sir Michael Hargrove, his face more haggard than Miss Marple had seen it before. His eyes were shadowed, and his usual confident demeanor was replaced with an almost visceral unease. I was wondering when you'd come looking for these, Sir Michael said, his voice tight with barely contained tension. He motioned to the desk, where the papers lay. I assume you found what you were looking for? Lady Evelyn stiffened, her hands clenched at her sides. You don't have to speak in riddles, Michael, she replied. Miss Marple knows. What's going on? Dr. Carter. I suggest, Evelyn, that you don't speak about things you don't understand, Sir Michael interrupted, his tone sharply cutting through the tension. He stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. No one is accusing anyone yet, she said, her voice calm but firm. But I must ask, why would Dr. Carter be looking through these papers? What exactly was he trying to uncover? Sir. Michael's eyes flickered with a mix of defensiveness and guilt. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with the question, as though weighing his options carefully before responding. He was looking for something that didn't concern him, Sir Michael said finally, his voice low. There are things in those documents, things I never wanted brought to light. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. What sort of things? Sir Michael's gaze faltered, and he stepped back, running a hand through his hair. Things that would put everything I've worked for at risk. Things that would ruin my family's name, my father's legacy. And I'll be damned if I let anyone destroy that over some old family secrets. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she carefully processed his words. The fear in Sir Michael's voice was unmistakable. This was no longer just a matter of Dr. Carter's disappearance. It was about something far more personal, something deeply ingrained in the fabric of the Hargrove family history. And these secrets, Sir Michael, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but piercing. What do they have to do with Dr. Carter? Why was he involved? Sir Michael exhaled sharply, his face pale. He was looking for something in those papers, something that he thought would explain the discrepancies in my father's financial dealings. But he was too late. What he found wasn't just a mistake or a simple oversight. It was a deliberate cover-up. Miss Marple took a step closer, her heart pounding with a sudden understanding. The cover-up wasn't just about financial mismanagement. It was about something far darker, something that could have ruined Sir Michael's father if it had ever come to light. "You're saying Dr. Carter knew too much," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. Sir Michael's jaw clenched. "Yes." And just like that, the final piece clicked into place. Dr. Carter had been trying to uncover the truth, a truth that was so dangerous it had cost him his life. Miss Marple stood up, her thoughts racing. This was no longer just a mystery about a missing physician. It was a case of long-buried secrets that had festered for years. Dr. Carter's disappearance was only the beginning. "We need to find out what Dr. Carter knew," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but full of resolve. "I'll speak with the constable, but I also think it's time to speak with someone who knows more about these dealings, someone who might have a clearer picture of your family's history, Sir Michael." Sir Michael's face darkened, and he took a step toward Miss Marple, his voice low. "I don't know what you think you'll find, Miss Marple, but there are things in my past that are better left uncovered." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes kind but firm. "Oh, dear Sir Michael, it's never about what I think I'll find. It's about what you're hiding. And trust me, your secrets won't remain hidden much longer." Chapter 6. The next few days in Dunwich were quiet, but the calm felt unnerving, as though the village was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. The search for Dr. Carter continued, but the lack of new information was only adding to the growing unease among the villagers. While Miss Marple's mind remained occupied with the mysteries surrounding Dr. Carter's disappearance, she knew it was time to delve deeper into the secrets of the Hargrove family. Surrey. Michael had been less than forthcoming, but Miss Marple knew that fear often led to unspoken truths. He was clearly hiding something connected to his father's legacy, something too dangerous to allow the village to uncover. But why had Dr. Carter been involved in this discovery? And more importantly, why had he been silenced? Miss D.T. Marple's thoughts turned to the documents she had seen in Sir Michael's study. The papers had been tucked away, hidden among other innocuous legal records, but they held the key to understanding what Dr. Carter had uncovered. Miss Marple had no doubt that these were more than just financial dealings. There was something deeply wrong with them, something tied to the Hargrove family's past. Lady Evelyn had mentioned that Dr. Carter had been looking through the papers for weeks. But had he found something, or had he been looking for something specific? Miss Marple's instincts told her the answer was the former. Dr. Carter had not been searching aimlessly. He had found something important, something that could have destroyed Sir Michael's family name. And now he was gone. But what exactly had he discovered? Miss Marple knew that the village archives could provide the missing link between Dr. Carter's discovery and Sir Michael's hidden secrets. The archive, located in the small stone building near the church, housed centuries of records, everything from property deeds to personal letters, and it was rarely accessed by the villagers. Miss Marple arrived early one morning, just as the sun began to rise over the village, casting a soft golden light on the old cobblestone streets. The archive's door creaked open, revealing the rows of dusty shelves and stacks of old records. It smelled of ink and parchment, a scent that always reminded her of the past, the kind of past that was difficult to leave behind. The archivist, a man by the name of Mr. Turner, was already there, his round glasses perched on his nose as he carefully sorted through some paperwork. He looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said politely, brushing his hands on his trousers. "What can I do for you today?" "I was hoping to look through some of the records related to the Hargrove family," Miss Marple said, her tone casual but sharp. "Particularly any documents that might have been filed during the time of Lord Hargrove's death." Mr. Turner's face changed slightly. There was a brief flash of something in his eyes, unease, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Of course," he said, stepping aside to reveal the large wooden drawers that contained the archives. "I'll pull up what we have. From that period. It's all in order, though there's not much of note. I'm afraid the Hargrove family has always kept their records fairly private." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. She had no intention of merely skimming the records. She needed to know everything. Who owned what debts were owed, who had been involved in the dealings. The papers she'd seen in Sir Michael's study were far too carefully hidden to be simple financial documents. There had to be something more. Mr. Turner returned with a small stack of yellowed documents, neatly organized. He handed them over, but Miss Marple's eyes were already skimming over them, looking for anything unusual. As she flipped through the pages, one particular letter caught her attention. It was addressed to Lord Hargrove, dated from several years before his death. The contents were ominous, detailing a large sum of money that had been loaned to the Hargrove estate by an unnamed benefactor. There was something about the tone of the letter, something that felt urgent. The words repayment and due were heavily underlined. She turned the letter over and found a seal that had been partially rubbed away. There was something familiar about the seal, but she couldn't quite place it. Her fingers lingered on it for a moment before she folded the letter back and tucked it into her bag. She needed to examine this more carefully later. As Miss Marple exited the archive, the morning sun had grown brighter, casting long shadows over the village square. The day ahead was quiet, almost unnaturally so. She decided to visit Sir Michael. There was something about the letter and the hidden debts that needed clarification. Miss Marple had no intention of confronting him directly about the family secrets, but she needed to see if his reaction would reveal something he was still trying to hide. Sir Michael was in his study when Miss Marple arrived, his face drawn and weary as he sat behind his desk. When he looked up, the usual arrogance that had always been present in his expression had faded. Now, there was just the weariness of a man who was trapped in his own lies. "Miss Marple," Sir Michael said, trying to mask the tension in his voice. "What brings you to Hargrove Hall today?" "I've been going through some of the records in the village archive," Miss Marple began, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "I came across a letter addressed to your father, a letter from a creditor who had loaned a rather substantial sum to the estate. It seems the debt was never fully paid off." Sir Michael's eyes flickered with surprise, then quickly narrowed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Miss Marple, but that's old news. My father's business dealings were never of concern to anyone but him. Those debts have been settled." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm sure they have, Sir Michael. But you must understand, I'm not suggesting anything untoward. I'm simply trying to understand the situation. After all, Dr. Carter seemed to have been examining those records with quite some interest." Sir Michael's jaw clenched, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of genuine fear cross his face. He stood up abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I don't know what you think you're playing at, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and strained, "but I suggest you drop this matter before it gets out of hand." Miss Marple stood still, her expression calm, though her heart quickened. There it was, the panic, the fear of exposure. "No, Sir Michael," she replied gently, her voice steady. "I believe we've only just begun." Chapter 7. The tension in Hargrove Hall was thick, hanging in the air like a storm cloud just waiting to burst. Miss Marple left Sir Michael's study, her mind racing with the information she had gathered. His reaction had been far too nervous to be dismissive of the records she'd found. Something was definitely wrong, and Dr. Carter had stumbled onto it. The letter from the creditor had hinted at something bigger than simple financial oversight, and Sir Michael's defensive behavior confirmed her suspicions. As Miss Marple walked back toward the village, she pondered what she had learned. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that Dr. Carter had unearthed something far darker than anyone had anticipated. Secrets hidden in plain sight. And now it was up to her to piece those secrets together. Miss Marple wasted no time in seeking out Constable Green, who was stationed at the village constabulary, a small stone building that sat at the edge of the village square. The constable had been busy with the search efforts, but Miss Marple knew he had information that could be crucial to solving the mystery. As she entered the office, the constable looked up from the paperwork on his desk, his eyes tired but alert. "Miss Marple," Constable Green greeted her, giving her a weary smile. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to ask you a few questions about Dr. Carter's disappearance," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "There's something I believe we've all overlooked." The constable raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go ahead, Miss Marple. If you've come to help, we could certainly use it." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her tone soft but deliberate. "I've been looking through some of the Hargrove estate's records, and I found something that seems important. There's a letter from a creditor who lent the Hargrove family a large sum of money, a sum that, according to the letter, was never paid back. I also know that Dr. Carter had been going through these very records before his disappearance." Constable Green's eyes narrowed. "That's interesting. I hadn't heard anything about that," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "Dr. Carter's interest in these documents suggests there's something much deeper at play. It's clear to me that he discovered something about the Hargrove family's past, something that someone didn't want uncovered." Constable Green rubbed his chin thoughtfully, then sighed. "You're not wrong, Miss Marple. There have been rumors in the village about some unsavory dealings that the Hargroves might have been involved in. But it's all so muddled, no one really knows the full story. The old man, Lord Hargrove, was known for being secretive, and now Sir Michael's taken over the estate. People don't talk much about the past." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And you believe there's more to those rumors? More than just whispers?" The constable hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. "Yes, but it's delicate, Miss Marple. If what Dr. Carter uncovered really was dangerous, we could be dealing with something far more sinister than just financial mismanagement." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "And I believe someone is willing to go to great lengths to keep those secrets buried." The constable's brow furrowed. "So you think Dr. Carter was silenced because of what he found?" Miss Marple nodded gravely. "I do. And I think the Hargrove family is at the heart of it." Later that day, as Miss Marple continued to piece together the mystery, she paid a visit to the village inn, where a quiet, unassuming barmaid named Emily had worked for years. Emily was a simple woman, known for her sharp memory and her ability to recall small details. If anyone in the village had noticed something unusual in the days leading up to Dr. Carter's disappearance, it would likely be her. The inn was quieter than usual, and Emily was standing behind the counter, polishing glasses. When Miss Marple approached, she gave her a warm smile, though Miss Marple could see the slight worry in her eyes. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Emily greeted her, her voice soft. "Is there something I can help you with today?" "I was hoping to ask you a few questions, Emily," Miss Marple began. "You've worked at the inn for quite some time, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am. Nearly 5 years now," Emily replied, her hands stilling for a moment as she set the glass down. "I know everyone in this village, it seems." "That's exactly why I wanted to speak with you," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I understand that you might have seen Dr. Carter in the days before his disappearance. Perhaps he mentioned something unusual to you?" Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Well, now that you mention it, he did come in one evening just before all this started. He was sitting at the bar, looking, well, troubled. He didn't say much, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, as though he thought someone might be watching him." She paused, then leaned in closer. Sir Michael was in his study when Miss Marple arrived, his face drawn and weary as he sat behind his desk. When he looked up, the usual arrogance that had always been present in his expression had faded. Now, there was just the weariness of a man who was trapped in his own lies. "Miss Marple," Sir Michael said, trying to mask the tension in his voice, "what brings you to Hargrove Hall today?" "I've been going through some of the records in the village archive," Miss Marple began, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "I came across a letter addressed to your father, a letter from a creditor who had loaned a rather substantial sum to the estate. It seems the debt was never fully paid off." Sir Michael's eyes flickered with surprise, then quickly narrowed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Miss Marple, but that's old news. My father's business dealings were never of concern to anyone but him. Those debts have been settled." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm sure they have, Sir Michael. But you must understand, I'm not suggesting anything untoward. I'm simply trying to understand the situation. After all, Dr. Carter seemed to have been examining those records with quite some interest." Sir Michael's jaw clenched, and for the first time Miss Marple saw a flicker of genuine fear cross his face. He stood up abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I don't know what you think you're playing at, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and strained, "but I suggest you drop this matter before it gets out of hand." Miss Marple stood still, her expression calm, though her heart quickened. There it was, the panic, the fear of exposure. "No, Sir Michael," she replied gently, her voice steady. "I believe we've only just begun." Chapter 8. The confrontation with Sir Michael left Miss Marple with a heightened sense of urgency. His words, laced with veiled threats, only served to confirm her suspicions. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing against her as she walked back to her cottage. It was becoming clearer with each passing moment that Dr. Carter had uncovered something so dangerous, so deeply buried, that Sir Michael, and likely others, were willing to go to any lengths to keep it hidden. Miss Marple's instincts told her that the end game was nearing. The killer was no longer hiding. They were preparing to make their final move, and Miss Marple had to be ready. But the question remained. What would their next step be? The following day, Miss Marple returned to Hargrove Hall, determined to sift through the remaining papers in Sir Michael's study. She needed to understand exactly what Dr. Carter had discovered. What had the family secrets been? Something about debts, sure, but something more sinister lay beneath the surface. There was a clear fear among Sir Michael and his wife, and Miss Marple knew it was time to dig deeper. Lady Evelyn greeted her with a polite but cautious smile when Miss Marple arrived at the estate. Her eyes were shadowed, and there was a look of worry in her gaze. She was trying too hard to appear calm, but the tension in her movements was unmistakable. "Miss Marple, I hope you found everything you needed," Lady Evelyn said as they walked through the hallways, leading her toward the study. "I know it must all be difficult to understand." Miss Marple nodded. "I think there's a piece of this puzzle we've overlooked, Lady Evelyn. Dr. Carter's concern about your family's business, the letter from the creditor, and the documents. They all point to something far darker than we first realized." Lady Evelyn stopped walking, her hand resting briefly on the doorframe. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? Surely there's some misunderstanding. You don't believe—" Her voice trailed off, but the uncertainty in her tone told Miss Marple that she was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. "I believe," Miss Marple said firmly, "that Dr. Carter's investigation into these documents was not an accident. He found something that involved more than just money. And now, I believe, we are closer than ever to uncovering the truth behind his disappearance." Lady Evelyn's expression faltered, her lips trembling slightly. "I never wanted this for anyone to know. But I think you're right, Miss Marple. It's time for the truth to be exposed. I don't think I can hide it anymore." Miss Marple stepped forward, a sense of finality in her voice. "We'll need to look through everything, Lady Evelyn. We need to know what Dr. Carter found, and we need to know who will stop at nothing to keep it hidden." Once inside the study, Miss Marple went straight to the desk where Sir Michael had kept the papers. The room was eerily quiet now, as though even the walls were holding their breath, afraid of what might come next. She felt Lady Evelyn watching her closely, but the older woman said nothing, her gaze heavy with guilt. Miss Marple methodically sifted through the papers on the desk, each piece more revealing than the last. But then, beneath a pile of ordinary correspondence, she found something that sent a chill down her spine. A letter, folded and sealed, its edges worn from age. The seal was familiar. It was the same mark Miss Marple had seen earlier on the word creditor's letter, but this one had been carefully hidden from view. Lady Evelyn, now standing behind her, gave a soft gasp. "That letter. I thought it was lost. I never wanted you to find it." Miss Marple held the letter in her hand, feeling the weight of it. "This letter is important, Lady Evelyn. I can feel it. It holds the answers to all of this." She broke. The seal and the letter inside was written in a hurried, urgent hand. The words on the page were not just financial. They were deeply personal, as if someone had been trying to convey a warning. It spoke of dealings that went wrong, of promises that had been broken, and of a debt that had yet to be repaid. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the final line. "If you don't want the past to destroy us all, you must end this now, before it's too late." The words struck a chord in Miss Marple's mind. The urgency, the threat hidden in those few lines. It was clear that someone had been desperate to keep these documents from ever being seen. And now, Miss Marple had a name to go with the fear that had been growing in the village. As Miss Marple absorbed the letter's contents, she heard the faint creak of the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. She turned, her hand still clutching the letter, and saw Sir Michael standing in the doorway, his face pale, his jaw tight with anger. "You shouldn't have come here, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a low growl. "You've made a mistake." Miss Marple stood, her gaze unwavering. "I don't think it's a mistake, Sir Michael. In fact, I think it's the only way we'll ever get to the truth." Sir Michael's hands clenched into fists. "You've meddled in things you don't understand," he warned, taking a step toward her. "This is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. You don't know what you're dealing with." Miss Marple took a step back, her voice calm but firm. "No, Sir Michael. I believe you are the one who doesn't understand. You've been hiding the truth for far too long, and now it's time to face the consequences." Lady Evelyn, still standing at the edge of the room, spoke softly. "Michael, please, it's over. Let Miss Marple help us. For a moment, sir, Michael's expression softened, as though the weight of the situation was finally settling in. But then his eyes hardened, and his next words were laden with threat. "You don't know what's coming, Miss Marple. There are people who will do anything to keep this quiet." At that moment, Miss Marple knew. She had seen the fear in Sir Michael's eyes, and it was not just fear of exposure. It was fear of something far darker, something that stretched far beyond the family secrets she had uncovered. "Then I suggest you be careful, Sir Michael," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unyielding, "because the truth always finds its way to the surface, and when it does, you won't be able to stop it." Chapter 9. The air in Hargrove Hall felt thick, heavy with the impending confrontation that had been brewing for weeks. Sir Michael's warning hung in the air, a threat wrapped in layers of fear and defiance. But Miss Marple, despite the tension that crackled around her, remained unshaken. She had long ago learned that fear, however deeply ingrained, was the greatest sign of weakness. She could see the truth now more clearly than ever. Dr. Carter's disappearance, the hidden documents, the debt owed by the Hargrove estate, all of it pointed to a web of lies that had been woven together for years, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it, no matter the cost. The problem now, as she glanced at Sir Michael, was not the danger he posed, but rather the dangerous individuals who might be lurking in the background, those who were willing to go to any lengths to keep the secrets buried. Sir Michael, though clearly shaken, was not the real threat. It was the people he feared that Miss Marple had to uncover. As evening fell over the village, Miss Marple made her way to the village inn once again. She had learned much in the past days, but she needed one more piece to complete the puzzle. Emily, the barmaid, had been a source of useful information, but there was one person Miss Marple knew she had to speak with, a person who might hold the final key to understanding: the Hargrove family's past. The inn was quieter now, with only a few patrons scattered about. Emily was behind the counter, her usual cheerful demeanor absent. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, her eyes filled with unease. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Emily greeted, her voice softer than usual. "What can I do for you tonight?" "I need to ask you about something that's been on my mind," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "You mentioned once that Dr. Carter had been in the inn the night before he disappeared. You said he'd been acting strangely. Do you remember anything else about that night?" Emily hesitated, her fingers twitching as she wiped a glass clean. "I remember him coming in. He was quiet, but there was something in his eyes. I've never seen him like that before. But what really struck me was that he didn't drink much that evening, which isn't like him. And when he left, he didn't say goodbye. It was as if he was in a hurry." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Was he alone that night?" Emily nodded. "Yes, he was. But when he left, he glanced around, like he was looking for someone. I thought it was odd, but he left quickly after that. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I'm starting to wonder." "What do you mean?" Miss Marple asked. Emily lowered her voice, glancing around the room before speaking. "Well, after Dr. Carter left, there was someone who came in right after him. I didn't see them at first, but they sat at the far end of the room, their back to the wall, watching the door. They didn't order anything, just sat there in silence. It made me uneasy. And I swear, Miss Marple, I've never seen them before in my life." "Did they speak to anyone?" Miss Marple asked, her interest piqued. "No, not a word. They just sat there, almost like they were waiting for someone. I didn't recognize them, but there was something about the way they carried themselves, Something familiar, but not in a good way. Miss Marple thought for a moment. Someone had been watching Dr. Carter, waiting for him to leave the inn. This was no accident. Whoever had been watching him had known exactly when he would leave, and had likely followed him after that. It was clear now that Dr. Carter had not just disappeared, but had been tracked by someone who was determined to silence him before he could expose the truth. "I need you to think carefully, Emily," Miss Marple said. "Do you recall anything about that person? Anything at all?" Emily frowned, clearly trying to remember. Then her eyes widened slightly, as if a memory had suddenly clicked into place. There was one thing. The person was wearing a dark coat, but the strangest part was that they were carrying a small briefcase, just like the kind Dr. Carter would use when he went out on calls. Miss Marple felt a jolt of realization. The connection was unmistakable. Whoever had been following Dr. Carter wasn't just a passerby. They were someone with knowledge of Dr. Carter's routine, someone who had been waiting for him to uncover something specific. And it was time to confront Sir Michael once again. Miss Marple arrived back at Hargrove Hall just as dusk settled over the estate. Sir Michael was in the library, pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. When he saw Miss Marple enter, his eyes narrowed in what could only be described as a mix of anger and fear. "You again," Sir Michael said, his voice tight. "I warned you to stay out of this." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Sir Michael," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "There are too many pieces to this puzzle that are still missing." Sir Michael turned, sharply, his face red with frustration. "What do you want from me? You have no idea what you're dealing with, Miss Marple. Dr. Carter was a fool, and now he's gone because of it." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but insistent. "I think Dr. Carter was getting too close to the truth. He uncovered something, didn't he? Something about your family's dealings, something that you were trying to keep hidden." Sir Michael froze, his breath catching for a moment. "You don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I know more than you think, Sir Michael. I know about the debts, the creditors, the family secrets. But most importantly, I know about the person who has been following Dr. Carter. The one with the briefcase. The one who was watching him that night." For a brief moment, Sir Michael's face turned ashen. He glanced toward the door, as if considering whether to flee or face the inevitable. He knew it was too late to turn back. Chapter 10. The silence in the room was suffocating, hanging between them like a thick fog. Sir Michael stood frozen, his hand gripping the edge of his desk, as though trying to keep himself steady. His face had gone pale, his usual composure shattered, in the face of Miss Marple's relentless pursuit of the truth. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. She had spent a lifetime uncovering secrets, reading people's faces and bodies for the smallest flickers of truth, and she could see it now. Sakatide, fear in Sir Michael's eyes, the barely contained panic. "You've already done it, Sir Michael," Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "You've gone too far to turn back now. Dr. Carter was right to investigate. He was getting too close to the truth, and that's why you had to silence him. But it's not too late for you to come clean. There's a way to end this without anyone else being hurt." Sir Michael's eyes flicked nervously to the door again. He was debating whether to flee, whether to silence Miss Marple in the same way he had dealt with Dr. Carter. But the weight of her words seemed to paralyze him. "You don't understand," Sir Michael finally whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of regret and something darker. "You don't know the lengths we had to go to, the things we had to cover up. Miss Marple stepped closer, her presence steady. I know, Sir Michael. You tried to bury the past, but the past never stays buried. Dr. Carter knew that. He saw something in the records, something that threatened to expose everything you and your family have been hiding. And when he started getting too close, you made sure he couldn't talk. Sir Michael dropped his hand from the desk and ran it through his hair, his face contorted with defeat. You have no idea what my family has been through. The debts, the shame. My father, he left me with nothing but a broken legacy. I had to protect what little was left. Miss Marple regarded him carefully, her eyes sharp with understanding. So you thought silencing Dr. Carter would protect you? But what about the others, Lady Evelyn, Eleanor? They don't deserve to be trapped in the lies you've built. Sir Michael looked away, guilt flashing across his face. He had never seen his family as anything more than extensions of his own ambitions and fears. His eyes hardened as he finally spoke, his words heavy with finality. It was never about the money, Miss Marple, he said slowly. It was about control. My father made a deal with people, dangerous people, years ago. When he died, I inherited more than just his estate. I inherited his dealings. Dr. Carter was getting too close to something I wasn't prepared to let anyone uncover. Miss Marple's heart pounded with the knowledge she had been waiting for. The dangerous people Sir Michael referred to, the ones behind the hidden deals, the ones who were connected to the debts, these were the people who had the power to destroy everything. But it wasn't just about money. It was about power, about control over everything. And now Dr. Carter had paid the price for his curiosity. You killed him because he was going to expose everything, Miss Marple said softly. But I don't think you did it alone, did you? You weren't the only one who wanted Dr. Carter silenced. Sir Michael's face tightened as if he had been struck. He took a few unsteady steps back, unable to meet her gaze. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Sir Michael muttered, his voice hoarse. I just wanted to protect my family. Miss Marple's expression softened ever so slightly. You thought you were protecting them, but you were only hiding the truth. The truth has a way of coming to light, Sir Michael, no matter how hard we try to keep it buried. Just as Miss Marple was about to press further, the door to the study opened with a quiet creak, and Lady Evelyn stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She looked from Sir Michael to Miss Marple, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. Michael? She whispered, her voice barely audible. What's going on? What are you telling her? Sir Michael turned to face his wife, his expression hardening again. Evelyn, you don't need to be involved in this. It's over. The truth is out. There's nothing more to be said. But Lady Evelyn wasn't convinced. She stepped forward, her voice rising slightly. What are you talking about? What's happened to Dr. Carter? Why does it feel like everything's falling apart? Miss Marple turned to Lady Evelyn, her expression thoughtful. I think it's time for the truth to come out, Lady Evelyn. Your husband has been hiding a dangerous secret, one that goes back to his father's dealings. Dr. Carter knew too much, and he was silenced. Lady Evelyn's face drained of color as she took a step back, shock registering on her features. What do you mean, silenced? What are you saying? Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but resolute. Dr. Carter uncovered something in your family's past, something that threatened to ruin everything. Sir Michael was desperate to protect his family, but in doing so, he allowed other people to control him. And now, it's led to murder. Tears welled up in Lady Evelyn's eyes as the weight of Miss Marple's words hit her. She turned to her husband, her voice cracking. "Michael, is this true? Did you do this?" Sir Michael remained silent, his head lowered in shame. The guilt was undeniable, and Lady Evelyn could no longer pretend otherwise. There was a long silence in the room as Lady Evelyn's realizations sank in. Finally, she took a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "What happens now, Miss Marple? What happens to us?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the window, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the bigger picture. The truth had a way of coming out, whether people were ready for it or not. And now that it had been exposed, the consequences would be far-reaching. But Miss Marple knew that justice, however delayed, had a way of making everything right in the end. "We will let the authorities handle it from here," Miss Marple said quietly. "The truth is already out. What happens next is out of our hands." Lady Evelyn collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands, while Sir Michael stood at the window, his posture defeated, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Miss Marple glanced at them both before turning toward the door. The puzzle was complete, the pieces finally falling into place. But there was still one last step to take, one final move that would bring everything to its conclusion. As Miss Marple stepped outside into the soft evening air, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. She had uncovered the truth. And while the past could never be fully undone, it could be understood, and, in some small way, redeemed.